Welcome to the Unity and Struggle YouTube series on race and capitalism. Unity and Struggle is a revolutionary grouping, and in this moment, we see our role as mostly preparing the conditions for mass revolutionary movements to emerge. We do this by getting involved in local organizing, what some have termed base building work, and by taking theoretical study and reflection seriously. Many of us have participated in various waves of struggle, dating from the 2001 anti-war movement to the more recent 2014 and 2020 Black Lives Matter movements and the ongoing movement to stop Cop City. At times, we do intensive national studies to help make sense of the conditions that are unfolding around us, and this is one of those times. We are very excited to continue our long-term study on race and capitalism and the mutually constituting relationships between the two. This episode covers the third section of part 3 of our race study. For part 1, we synthesized lessons periodically with the Rev Left radio podcast and focused primarily on the antebellum period of the United States. You can find links to those interviews and our syllabi linked in the show notes, as well as on our website at unityandstruggle.org. For part 2, we continued our study here on YouTube and covered 3 different sections: settler colonialism, Reconstruction in the United States, and segregation and industrialization. You can find those episodes on our YouTube channel and the accompanying syllabus on our website. Part 3 will trace the relationship between capitalism and race in the United States from the 1940s to the present. The readings look at the subjective and objective formation of race relations through the 20th and 21st centuries and arriving at our current moment. For this episode, we'll be discussing the third section of part 3, which focuses on the advent of state-managed migration in the United States and the development of neoliberalism. We don't claim to be experts, but political co-thinkers attempting to understand one dimension of the social relations of our world. So thanks for joining us in this endeavor. Share, comment, and follow along. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or on social media. Our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is @UnityandStrug. My name is Layla, and I'll be facilitating the discussion with Eve, Diane, and Adder. So let's start the discussion. For my first question, let's start with why migration is important in this moment, and what does race or racialization have to do with migration and immigration?
Yeah, thanks for having us back. This is Eve. I can start with this one. I just have a couple of sort of like intro comments, but I feel like I'm gonna pass this question off to Diane largely. But just to give some background information, we've been doing this study since 2019. So it's been a very long-term study, and we started this writing the syllabus a couple years before that even. So when we first set out to do this study, in scope, we wanted to kind of limit it to the Black-white relation in the US. But as we started reading and we began fleshing out our unitary framework, we realized that we can't discuss the Black-white relation without also discussing the indigenous white relation, the Latina white relation, the Asian white relation, and the relations between people of color and gender, etc., the nation, imperialism, and goes on and on. So here we are, 5 years later, still doing this ongoing race study. And last year, when we got to the final part, which covers from the 1960s until the present, we placed this as kind of an aside on migration because we saw the 1965 moment as a key moment in shaping migration in the US and the beginning, a sort of a beginning to the end of Keynesianism, which has had its own unique logic around race formation. So fortunately, we've been doing this study as UNS alongside our comrade Diane, who's here today, who studies migration in her graduate work. So Diane was able to choose the majority of the readings for this section and sort of guide us through this. So I'm going to pass it off to Diane to kind of introduce our readings for this section.
Thanks, Eve, for that intro. And I want to just say thank you all so much for keeping up with us. I've also participated in this race study for 5 years now, and It's incredible how much we study um, that just tends to just appear in what we need to like learn to effectively organize. So, I'd like to kind of split the question into two, but also connect them. So, why is migration important at this moment? It's 2024 and we're going into an election cycle in the United States. And every political cycle, we tend to see immigration as a political foray on all sides. There's always usually some sort of terminology to describe contentious immigrant policy. And so today, we are definitely reeling between the misnomer of what's considered the migrant crisis, or historically, and today too, you can also hear the so-called migrant invasion. And all of that politically is just a way to activate the dehumanization of folks who are migrating, and also fortify border politics that contribute to capitalist accumulation. And so I think together we recognize through the readings that we did that this isn't happenstance, it's not a one-off thing, but it's truly by design. Really to highlight that immigration and migration, which can be interchangeable terms as how we studied it, has been historically been manipulated by political parties to disrupt and disorganize labor and manipulate the mobility of people as workers and also people as people with that do have the right to move to where they so do choose. So one of the key texts I'd like to encourage folks to work through or with if they're getting into migrant solidarity work is Border and Rule by Harsha Walia. And so she lays out that borders are not fixed or static lines. They're productive regimes currently generated by and producing social relations of dominance. So in addition to migration being a consequence of empire, capitalism, climate catastrophe, and oppressive hierarchies, contemporary migration is itself a mode of global governance, capital accumulation, and gendered racial class formation. And so that element of the gendered racial class formation leads us to this next question, which is, what does race have to do with it? What does race have to do with, or racialization with immigration to the United States, migration to the United States? And what we realized historically, whether looking at earlier immigration policies in the United States from 1924 to 1965, and currently, nations that are sending folks into the United States are actively being racialized as either workers, in some cases, as we learned from racialization politics in California, with Chinese workers coming in the 1920s, to racialization politics that encouraged the 1965 immigration policy that actively eliminated work, or let me say sharpened the policy to which working class folks from the global South had less ability to come into the United States as opposed to the middle to upper middle class and student population. These border externalization processes are meant to actually classify in a global hegemonic system who is worthy of citizenship and the ability to be mobile and who isn't. So, and also just to kind of take a second, when we're talking about border externalization and those practices, we're really thinking through the work of the United States, Canada, Australia, and the UK, and their political orientation to push their politics and their bordering practices beyond the geographical territory, the actual land, to influence or control capital and people migration from other nation states. And so we can see this as a contemporary way to measure the disorganization also of the global working class. through neoliberal capitalist interests, like I just said, and also what's new, which is the rise of the security surveillance state.
Immigration as a form of disorganization of the working class is such a great point. So it seems like the ability of folks to be able to migrate seems to depend on the nation state. So, what did you all learn about this relationship between the nation or a nation and someone's ability to migrate?
Absolutely, I'll take this one on. So kind of how I just mentioned, what we learned from sitting with Justin Irish Akon's work, what from Lloyd and Mounts as well, in their book Borders and Bases, is that essentially US restrictions for migration or immigration into the United States, both, really depends on the geopolitical relationships that the United States has in relationship to the sending country. And what this ends up doing is dismantling free will of a migrant and their mobility, and also the larger movement of global working class. And this type of exercise from the nation state is ahistorical. If we contextualize and really think about migration in relationship to development, folks have always been able to move around to do what they need to do to fortify themselves and realize themselves as workers. However, these practices by the United States can kind of be siphoned into a couple of different directions. So when we were reading Lloyd and Mounts in their textbook, Boats, Borders, and Bases, we were able to look at specific policy from the United States that honed in on particular geopolitical processes in the 1980s and 90s that fortified an uneven relationship of the ability for folks to migrate from Cuba versus Haiti. So for those that may have some kind of inkling to the differences between Haitian migrants and Cuban migrants in terms of federal policy, is that there existed what was called wet foot, dry foot policy. And Lloyd and Mounts lay out very well how wet foot, dry foot policy really was a way to mask the US's intention of allowing for Cuban immigrants to come in and gain citizenship in its own paradigm, which is also a racialized paradigm, and actively disavow Haitian immigrants that were coming at the same time under the same premise from citizenship. And so while both Cubans and Haitians were coming in, especially the middle, well, the working classes of both in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, more likely than not, Haitian folks that were on boats that were Haitian would be stopped before reaching the shore. Because they were stopped before reaching the shore, they were not granted entry into port and they were not allowed to plead for asylum. That is counter to the practice for Cuban immigrants. Their boats were allowed to make shore, or they would actually be received from the water and they would be allowed to process and claim asylum. So here's an example of federal policy mitigating the right to asylum and activating its own type of political orientation to create a hegemonic structure for access of asylum. So that's one way that we were able to kind of sit through that activity. And it's really important because as we are in a new wave of asylum seeking struggles in the United States, we really should be keen to understanding the racialization factors that are activated as well in this moment in time, where certain groups, particularly ones that are coming from Eastern European countries, that are coming from countries where the United States is activated through its own geopolitical sphere, are having a much more smoother time getting asylum or regulation of their citizenship, potential citizenship paperwork, as opposed to folks coming from other parts of the global South, and particularly the continent of Africa, that are being disavowed of resources and access to the same pathways that folks coming in from Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, are. All of this plays into the geopolitical intentions of the United States. So now, what was really awesome too to sit with was that period of time, and then a larger scope of time that was given to us by Chacon in his text, The Border Crossed-Up. And we'll speak a little bit more on processes of the United States and financial capital that'll come up soon. But what Chacon lays out for us is understanding how a border externalization process looks like in terms of even bordering politics between two nations. So in Chacon's work, he lays out that he has a definition or an interpretation of what we should really call a free trade agreement. And so I'll just read briefly from his words here. Through the edges of the state, its two major political parties, and in alliance with the capitalist class of Mexico, the US state has transformed the region into a singular borderless economy dedicated to facilitating the movement of capital. Integration in this form has been accomplished through what is characterized as a free trade agreement. For the purpose of this book, I define an FTA as a state-crafted legal mechanism that supersedes and eventually eliminates the concept of national borders for the free movement of money. Also, he gives us another definition to think through the United States, which was called the North American model. And essentially, what he activates is that through capitalist accumulation, the North American model, which is the United States forcing or externalizing policies beyond its territory into Mexico, enforces inalienable rights for capital mobility, and then criminalizes the movement of labor. And it gives us border enforcement policies, for instance, that affect the working classes on the border of the United States and Mexico on different scales. Even the workers in Mexico and the United States are truly being fused together through different forms of the integrated supply chain production. And also, of course, manufactured products, which are moving between stages and built between national borders.
So it seems like the capitalists are saying borders for thee, but not for me.
Exactly. We would call that, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we were able to really dictate a bordering from above and bordering from below. So absolutely. Yeah.
So earlier y'all mentioned 1965 as a crucial period in regards to migration. This post-65 time period is also characterized by the domination of finance capital. So what is finance capital and how does it relate to nations and borders?
Hi, everyone. This is Adder. I haven't spoken yet, but hello. I am kind of a newcomer to race study. I'm like drop in, drop out. But I really wanted to do this section of the race study on migration because of the migrant solidarity work that Diane has been doing and because of where I live and what I'm observing where I live, which is in New York City. And as Diane was saying, we have a so-called migrant crisis that our political elite are really trying to craft a pretty evil narrative around right now. So I really wanted to understand migration and racialization more. And I feel like I did. So I'm going to jump in on this question on what is finance capital, which I feel like I'm kind of a goofy person to do this because I'm pretty far from being any kind of economist or even like having a, general understanding of it. not to sound a little too humble, but just being real about my, where I'm coming from. When we were doing the first week of reading of this study, which included Dennis Canterbury's Capital Accumulation and Migration, I was asking a lot of questions about what is finance capitalism. So with that, I'm happy to present you with my working definition of finance capital, which is probably pretty basic and could use elaboration, but I think, works for how we're thinking about finance capital in relationship to migration. It's, I think, a good starting off point, at least for me. So what is finance capital? I would define finance capitalism as a system in which capital is accumulating on itself without the middle step of commodity production. So through rent, interest rates, or speculation as examples. This is something like I feel like there is a mythology around finance capital as something that productive forces are dependent on. So banks can lend out money and landlords can rent out their spaces and then production can happen. You can lend out money and then development can happen. And then, of course, that's always good for the country that's developing. There's this kind of like power that finance capital is supposed to have that's like coming from the wealth, like inherent wealth of whoever is providing this form of capital. And we see this logic or relationship outlined in Ayala and Burnaby's Puerto Rico in the American Century. So we are backing up a little bit from this post 65 time period because I think financialization was happening for a while before then. But in Puerto Rico in the American century, Ayala and Burnaby are exploring this. They're outlining this process by which Puerto Rico becomes financialized. So they talk about how the Partido Popular Democrático, the PPD, which was the most prominent party in Puerto Rico in the 1940s, abandons the objective of political independence at that time in order to favor North American capital, the North American market, because they feel that they need to prioritize favorable trade or aid agreements with the United States. They want to keep themselves open for future development. So this leads to an ongoing process of financialization in Puerto Rico in the 40s and 50s, where the traditional industries of needlework and sugar become largely replaced with tourism and US-owned corporations that come to Puerto Rico to take advantage of this tax-free environment that they're able to conduct business in Puerto Rico due to the PPD's policies or agreements with North American financial interests. So what happens when all of these industries are becoming replaced with external investments? It leads to a gigantic wave of migration out of Puerto Rico. So in the same time period, or in the following time period from 1950 to 1970, there's a net migration of 27% of the island's population in 1950 out of Puerto Rico. And then by 1970, 70% of all productive wealth in Puerto Rico is owned by external investors. So that's kind of an illustration of how finance capital is expanding itself, and is a little bit of an illustration of that this logic that maybe it's putting out, and that some people are accepting as development and production are kind of dependent on the resources that you're getting from finance capital. What Canterbury is saying, though, is that it's the other way around. So rather than productive forces relying on finance capital, it's actually that finance capital relies on productive forces relying on migration processes and migrant labor. So yeah, I would say that this kind of logic flip reminds me of this myth that, for example, Europe was able to provide for its agricultural needs through the Industrial Revolution, right? There's this idea that there's this like big capitalist expansion in Europe, there's an Industrial Revolution, and then, oh my gosh, like through the progress that capitalism enables, like Europe is able to like, I don't know, develop itself to the giant that it is today or something. But actually, this is like pretty thoroughly debunked. It's the only way that it was able to provide for its agricultural needs was through colonial exploitation of the global south, through exploitation of people and land, right? So it's not that finance capital is really able to just kind of work as a system without displacing large populations of people, producing migration, and then without accumulating on those migration processes. So Canterbury is saying that finance capital is actually like its process of accumulation happens through these migration processes, through the by financializing the means by which migrants are leaving their countries of origin. This is pretty much a direct quote of the text. Financializing how they're functioning in their countries of destination, remitting resources to their home countries, and establishing businesses and other relations with them. And Chacon in The Border Crossed Us builds on this to include the infrastructure of the criminalization of migrants. So something that's really important that Canterbury is writing about is this relationship between development and globalization and capitalism, and specifically newer forms of capitalism like finance capitalism. So he writes that development is the process by which the capitalist system becomes universal to all countries in the globe, making countries which are already in the capitalist system more amenable to exploitation by finance capital, which dominates the capitalist system today. So, we could see this in the example of Puerto Rico. We can see this in many other places. In the Tren Maya, which is 904 miles of train that is being proposed and built through the southwest of Mexico for tourism, like tourist development, which Alicia Barcenas Cruz writes about. And she says that the purpose of a project like this is basically to integrate peasant and indigenous communities to Mexican modernity. So it's like through projects like that, through this replacement of industries with external investors, that's how finance capitalism is able to globalize itself. And so that's, like Diane was talking about, that's how free trade agreements are developed, and it just furthers the ability for capital to flow freely wherever it wants to go, while people are more and more limited and criminalized and exploited based on, where they are and where they're able to move to.
Right, and where their particular border is. So, can you talk more about bordering and how did you connect this to Marx's understanding of alienation?
Yes, I can talk more about bordering, and I would love to connect this to Marx's understanding of alienation, which, just another plug of Unity and Struggle. We are currently doing a Marx study as well. We do take our theory very seriously, as Layla shared in the beginning. And I'm also pretty new in studying this concept of alienation, though I've certainly been a lifelong student of this, or, direct observer and experiencer of this concept. So I think there are so many ways to tie migration and bordering and alienation together. The first, like the place that I would start is just thinking about how migration is a fact of life. Movement sustains all life, from movement along air and water currents to movement through and between regional ecologies, migration from one local ecosystem to another, one fragment of a global ecosystem to another. These kinds of movements are crucial to species survival and to biodiversity across like so many layers of life. Any local ecosystem you're looking at is not going to be its own self-sufficient and isolated loop. It's always going to have porous exchange with other ecosystems, and energy is meant to be able to circulate throughout this incredibly complex matrix. Just think of like birds migrating everywhere, and even like microbes like jumping from one body to another or something. There's all this movement and travel happening all the time. So migration is this incredibly natural process, and people really belong to the land and belong to these ecosystems, and just like have been migrating since people have been on this planet. But then you have this financialized and militarized like nation state matrix imposed, like superimposed on this ecological matrix. So I would say like a core part of this alienation is there and starts there. It's from this estrangement from ourselves and how we are embedded and connected to nature and ecological processes and our relationship with that.
I know the last readings we did when we're thinking through race is what do you do, or how can we process people of the African diaspora who were forcibly displaced, enslaved, and then alienated? So that's one big question. But I think to center it into this moment in time that we're looking at and the text we work through, the Ayala text is really great for us to think about how diaspora is a way to answer forms of alienation due to displacement and dispossession. So in that case study that we had, thinking about the political party that was at play, navigating and mitigating the role of US corporate interests that encouraged the first wave of Puerto Ricans to come into the US and work in these factories and situate a particular identity, Puerto Rican identity, to only be countered or be critiqued by much more working poor Puerto Ricans who were forcibly displaced from their land because of the US land grabs at that time and pushed into underserved communities all over the Northeast. And us untangling that type of contradiction of identity. What does it mean to be Puerto Rico? What does it mean to be Puerto Rican? Through the work of Ayala, really uplifted this point of one being alienated as a worker, but also, as you're saying, Ada, through the ecosystem that one is used to. So in that narrative, we learned about how there was different ways to identify as being Puerto Rican. It didn't work for everyone when this definition came from the university, for instance. We found out that was an elitist way of doing it. And instead, other ways or counter ways of identifying coming from the diaspora in New York to redefine experience and self in Puerto Rico actually answered the sentiment and the feeling of alienation that newer working class Puerto Ricans felt as immigrants in the United States. So yeah, I would just add that.
You know, as the first of my family to migrate from Puerto Rico, I am resonating with a lot of the conversation here.
Yeah, this point around dispossession and displacement as a process of alienation or as a process to alienation is a really good point. And I'm thinking of the Against the Grain interview we listened to with Alex Blanchette, who wrote this book called Porkopolis. And in it, he basically spent some time at a pork factory in the Midwest where 7 million hogs were raised and slaughtered every year. And at this complex, this like industrial complex, about 80% of the workers there were migrants, forming a community that spoke about 26 languages. And in the interview, he is talking about how, like, with this huge quantity of pigs that they're processing every year, that like the process for like perfecting their product becomes really intense, but actually what the managers of this factory are even more intent on is controlling the behavior of the workers. So actually controlling who workers are able to socialize with, where they're able to go. Also, that their reasoning for this is to lower the ability of contamination to be transmitted between workers, maybe working at different parts of this complex with each other. So basically controlling the workers' behavior as a way to better control the pork products that they are creating. And yeah, I think that is a incredibly disturbing example of, or a couple different facets of alienation, because you have your classic, you're being exploited by your employer, you're alienated from the product and activity of your labor, and you're also literally being isolated from your other workers in this community that you've migrated to, that all of your fellow coworkers have also migrated to. And Alex Blanchette in this interview is talking about how the strategy of the managers of this complex are to basically optimize the worker, to make them into more and more and more efficient workers. How can they optimize like the way that their bodies are moving and how they're operating in their social contexts in order to better and better serve their purpose of producing these pigs. So yeah, there's a lot of layers of alienation there, not to mention also the fact that they've already migrated from their home countries and, are part of this larger pattern of like these cultural expectations that arise of leaving your home community, leaving your home country to migrate and send back remittances, that in and of itself becoming an alienation from, your identity, and becoming folded into global capitalism.
So, alienation is something that we've talked about a lot in this series. Are there other concepts from past readings that connect to this section?
Of course, there are. Um, yeah, I think alienation is a big one. And as I mentioned, as we moved through this study, we noticed some gaps in our understanding racialization. And in correcting that, we still wanted to make sure that we were anchoring our understanding to anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in the US. So in order to do that, we applied several concepts from the our past study to this section, including alienation, as mentioned. But a couple others are the race fetish as a logical component of capitalism and free and unfree labor. So let me give just a very brief and potentially incomplete, very sorry, description of the fetish. Marx describes the fetish and arising from value relations as a social relationship between material things and a material relation between humans. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, it describes how all aspects of human interactions are mediated by commodities. So this often means money. We come into our many daily interactions with people on the basis of kind of what kind of housing we can afford, or where we work for a wage, or where we shop for groceries, maybe the types of dating apps we have. These are just some examples. There are many every day. But the point is that these commodities, including the money commodity, rule over us. Just just like my favorite toy from the 1990s, the Furby. It has a mind of its own. So, in the case of race, physical characteristics like skin, facial features, also cultural markers such as clothing, or maybe if you allow me to stretch the definition just of a commodity or a thing a little bit, we could say maybe accents or language or the sound of a spoken word. So in essence, we're talking about things, like markers of things. These things are given social meanings that are attached to positions within, or in the case of many Black people and migrants, exclusion from the labor process and the division of labor. In the post 1965 moment, these social meanings also carry the weight of the state. And, we've talked about this a lot in this podcast so far, so I'm not going to get into that too much. But the state sort of determines whether people are criminalized, whether their labor is controlled at the border, or whether they're given visas and welcomed with open arms, or maybe conditionally open arms. These sorts of things are the crux of how we've come to understand the racialization under capitalism throughout the study. For us, the fetish, or maybe more accurately, the racialization fetish, is the logical underpinning of the concrete and historical expressions of race. The second important concept that we brought from earlier studies in this study was around free and unfree labor. We found that in the past, capitalism has a general tendency to expel workers from the workforce, which puts the capitalists in good positions to drive down the price of labor as much as possible. So that means wages going down. That's something that we all experience. We've all been fighting against, since the dawn of capitalism. And as close to nothing as the capitalists can get this, the better it is for them. So this is where we see the like as wages are decreasing, and we're finding a little bit of a slippage from coerced labor, which is the condition of selling your labor under the conditions of capitalism. It's like we all have to go to work and sell our labor in order to reproduce ourselves every day. So we're all in this like sort of coerced relationship with labor. or like with our own labor. But we see a slippage into almost an unfree situation, and we find there in as close to unfree as possible this racialization process. So, that happens in prisons today often. And this is where we find criminalized types of people. So a criminalized Black person, an Indigenous person who's seen as an expendable resource under capitalism, is seen as an extension of the land that can just be sort of absorbed into capitalism or, genocided. This is where the backward Muslim is deemed a terrorist. This is where the quote unquote illegal undocumented person is formed. And then on the flip side, the so-called model minority, the good immigrant, and those there's a section of people who are sort of tied to the dream of becoming as white as possible, or as white as will be tolerated under this system. So in other words, we see in this migration section a sort of tethering of racialized people of color to the condition of being unwaged, or as close to unwaged as possible, hyperexploited, and at times wholly expelled from the labor process. Capital, as Adder mentioned, and put quite well, capital organizes people into their optimal categories. A hierarchy of those at the top who are worthy of access into imperial civil society and all of its nationalized and protected privileges, and those who are, by their very existence, stealing access to those privileges. So, for example, as both Ada and Diane mentioned, today in New York City, migrants are sort of the scapegoat of all the sources of all the failures of civil society. And this is something that, our politicians and rulers are, feeding us every day in the news and with their actions. So, people are blaming budget cuts on migrants, failing schools, crime, even the trains don't run properly because of the quote unquote migrant crisis. So this is something that we're just seeing constantly reproduced. And I'll give one last example. Adder mentioned that we rounded out our study with this against the grain interview on the person who is essentially researching the alienation of workers at the hog factory farm, the quote unquote optimization of the worker. So in this example, we also see the fetish as tethered to the condition of as close to unfree labor as possible. If we treat pigs like things, which they are treated like things under capitalism as a commodity, they're literally a commodity under capitalism, we see a clear process of the social becoming material. Our entire lives shapeshift and bend around what is needed for capitalists to make money. But it's also a specific, expendable, racialized, and criminalized layer facing these intense conditions. And I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I'm landing somewhere that's pretty obvious, right? But I think through our long-term study, we can kind of trace this process back to the beginning of capitalism historically, and also understand how it's not a new phenomenon. It's not a coincidence, but it's a phenomenon embedded in the logic or the very fabric of the capitalist mode of production. And that's essentially what we're trying to do with this study.
So, what are some ways that people are fighting against that logic of capitalism, as you put it? And how are race, migration, and working class solidarities coming together practically?
It's a really good question, because I would say that what we isolate and really indicate through study as true migrant solidarity, its end goal is to upend capitalist exploitation of workers, including migrant workers. And so to really sit with that, and in this current moment of, as Eve has talked about, I think I mentioned too, which was the impetus of me helping to curate this study, is that currently there is what's so-called a manufactured migrant crisis in New York. New York stands, as with other cities like Chicago, Washington, D.C., Boston, as what's called a sanctuary city, meaning that immigrants and documented folks are able to be able to access what they need to have an easier mobility in the city, be able to work, advocate for themselves, access social services, without being impeded due to their documentation. And through our study, as authors laid out that there has historically been a liberal response to migrant exclusion and migrant rights, Eve's piece, Rethinking Sanctuary Cities in an Age of Targeted Deportation, really lays out the framework to which we, as people who are organizing that aren't liberal, um, understand the dynamics to be at play. So even from the era of Obama, Sanctuary City was still met with the criminalization of migrants, whether it be through federal ICE deportation, inability to access work, be rightfully paid for your wages. And that accumulates today in New York City, where you have increased police presence, you have National Guard at migrant shelter sites. Migrant shelter sites are also city ran. They are run by private companies, and I'll definitely share some links around that. But all that to say, the element or the liberalization of what is understood to be a sanctuary city is really just a neoliberal answer to what is so-called the migrant crisis. So to combat that or to answer that through migrant solidarity work, in New York currently, there have been really great mutual aid initiatives that have created solidarity networks to best assist asylum seekers that are coming into New York from Port Authority and are being processed in the migrant shelter system. I did some of this work these past couple of months assisting continental African and Arab asylum seekers that are excluded from access to social services, as the city has explained that it is due to budget cuts and language, which we know, given our study of racialization and border externalization policies and US geopolitical policies, the true behind the inability of these asylum seekers to access resources that are entitled to them have to do with racializing and racializing processes and nation state bordering practices that exclude particular migrants from accessing what they need and continuously marginalizes them from their rights as workers. So one case that we've leaned on through study that is prominent and I think is a model from what we talked about as bordering from below, which is alter or external bordering practices that redefine, or affirm citizenship, not based on nation state practices, but in practices of belonging. It can be seen through the work of the Deliveristas in New York, which are undocumented delivery service workers who have organized to push forward bills that best fight for actual just wages for delivery folks that do delivery on bikes. That this type of work within the gig economy is something that can be scaled globally, where workers that are new to a community can use technology to plug in to participate. And so the Deliveristas definitely set a standard in thinking about how to best organize to accommodate and make sure that these workers, regardless of citizenship status, are able to actually access just wages for their work. So that's one example. Currently, mutual aid initiatives in New York are fighting against what's called the 30 to 60 day housing policy, which basically states that asylum seeking families and individuals only have 30 days for shelter. The mayor has codified the repeal of what was considered to be indefinite housing until people are put into much more permanent housing, as his desire to end the term of sanctuary city or the status of sanctuary city in New York. We know that this is sanctuary city, the policies of sanctuary city, the policies that best assist asylum seekers, migrants, economic migrants, whatever, what have you, and their ability to move in the city does not correlate with the mismanagement of funds by the city. And we see that through the increase of NYPD everywhere. And we can also monitor this with budget cuts in order to further fund NYPD. And now we see also like I said, the increase of other federal surveillance entities in the city. So yeah, I would offer that as an example. I think that on the ground in New York, things are definitely mobilizing a bit quicker as we're gearing into an election year. And as Eve mentioned, historically and continuously, just as capitalist accumulation is continuous, exploitation of the political being of migrants also becomes fodder and something that's played with during election season. So yeah.
Yeah, election season is definitely not something I'm looking forward to. So what's next for the study?
So, Layla, I know it's hard to believe, but believe it or not, we're actually coming up on our last section of our 5-year study. Can we put like an echo or maybe like an air horn effect on that? Maybe 5-year study. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're almost there, but we're not quite done yet. So we're starting our final section. And so we'll be back here one more time to round this out. In our final section, we'll look at our current moment, which is how we've kind of characterized a post-racial neoliberal moment from roughly the 1980s to present. So yeah, just a shout out to anyone who's been following us this entire time or even part of the time. We appreciate you. And as always, definitely send along any thoughts or questions. And yeah, I'll let you close this off, Layla. Thank you.
All right. So I'm very thankful to Unity and Struggle for putting on this race study, and to Eve, Diane, and Adder, of course, for sharing their thoughts and analysis. As Eve mentioned, there's one more section of part 3 of the race study, so be sure to subscribe to join us on our research. And thanks so much for joining us in this endeavor, and please share and comment on this episode to expand our reach. We'd love to hear from you on social media as well. Our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is @UnityandStrug. Solidarity.